Welcome to this episode of Thrive With Us. Today, my guest is Dr. Dana Jammal, a licensed psychologist at Thrive Wellbeing Center. She's been with us since November 2023 and has supported loads of individuals and couples aged 16 and above across a number of presenting problems. Dr. Dana has a doctorate in psychology from City University in the UK, and the predominant modality that she uses in her work is CBT. Today, we're going to pick her brain on challenging emotions and how we can change our relationship with them. Welcome, Dana.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So I just mentioned we're going to be talking about challenging emotions. And for anyone listening, what we really had in mind when we were talking about this episode is this idea that emotions are often categorized or labeled or viewed as either good or bad. So something like happiness or joy or contentment, we can put it in the good, positive category, and things like anger, sadness, embarrassment, those might be lumped more in the negative category. So today we're going to talk about how that came about, what it means, how it plays out, and how we can kind of change our relationship with them. So can you give me an overview of this topic and the emotions and where all of this comes from?
Yeah, sure. I think you summarized it really well. I think we do have a common misconception that I think still exists, that these challenging emotions are bad or inherently bad, or there's something wrong with us if we have them, if we experience them. And I think there's, a variety of reasons why this misconception, has been shaped and even reinforced till today. Whether it's cultural messages from the media, societal expectations, even messages we've heard growing up from parents, as well-intentioned as some parents might be. I think that this misconception, I think it can be rooted in this belief that happiness is the default state. And so any deviation from that is, a reflection of some sort of failure, that there's something wrong with me, right? And I think oftentimes we have these cultural narratives that still exist till today that sort of equate happiness with success, and any sort of, deviation from that as there's something wrong, I'm failing in some way, right? So I think there's a lot of different influences that have kind of reinforced this perception over time. And with that way of relating to emotions, we do tend to see a lot more kind of challenges that clients experience when it comes to their mental health. One thing that comes to mind is if we think about, even Stoic philosophy, oftentimes, when we think about that type of, ancient philosophical kind of belief system, it's like it tends to emphasize self-discipline. It tends to emphasize rationality, logic, And in a way, sometimes I feel that it can be misinterpreted or misapplied when it comes to our emotional experiences. In a way, perhaps where it almost ends up promoting the belief that strength comes from emotional control, strength comes from emotional restraint in order to maintain some form of composure and rationality, right? And I think that can, to some degree, shape our perception of these emotions in a way where we perceive them as some sort of weakness or failure on our part. And so I feel that because of that, we can often perceive them almost as things that we need to conquer or eradicate when we experience them.
Yeah, so I'm hearing from you a couple of different points, and I just want to clarify. So number one is this idea that happiness is really our default, or it should be our default. This is an idea and a narrative that a lot, if not most of us, have instilled in us. This is what we should be aiming for. So it's the golden emotion or state, if you will. So that's one thing. But then the other thing that you were discussing when you were referencing the Stoicism is this idea that, okay, well, we do feel other emotions, but there is this perception that we shouldn't display them. We shouldn't present as such, because if we do present as feeling, any of the so-called negative emotions we mentioned before, it's going to make us seem like we don't have restraint and control over our lives, and that's not an ideal thing. So the emotions, some of them are more ideal than others.
Mm-hmm.
That's the belief that's out there. And that irrespective of what we experience, we should be very careful about how we display them to other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good way of summarizing it. And I think, and that's where I sort of say that there can be this misinterpretation or misapplication of Stoicism in a way where we end up feeling like we have to suppress our emotions. And I think that's where it gets problematic, because we end up with suppression. I mean, suppression is it's a type of strategy that can be quite problematic because it tends to intensify our existing emotional distress. So in that way, I think it's, it's in almost an inadvertent kind of response to that, like, oh, maybe that means I should just suppress my emotions as opposed to express my vulnerability, just for the sake of, rationality, control, self-discipline, even resilience. You know what I mean? So, yeah.
So what I'm hearing from you is that often if somebody experiences something like, let's say, jealousy is a human experience. We've all been there. We will all be there at various points in time, but we're taught from a young age that it's not a good thing. And a lot of times feeling that way makes us feel guilty, ashamed, bad, sad, whatever. There's secondary and tertiary emotions. So maybe I pick up that I'm feeling a little bit jealous. Suppression would look like me kind of consciously or unconsciously being like, no. You shouldn't come across this way. You shouldn't feel like this. Just try and bury it. Is that what you mean?
Exactly. And suppression, the thing about suppression is that it's sort of this intentional physiological process where you exert tension to try to get rid of an emotion. And so, even the process in and of itself creates even more tension in the body. And so we see things like, elevated cortisol levels. People get sort of physical manifestations when it comes to suppression, tension headaches, gastrointestinal issues. And I think that's what is quite specific about suppression, is that we're intentionally pushing down an emotion because we feel like we shouldn't be feeling this emotion, or we don't want to be feeling this emotion. And sometimes if you think of, I like the metaphor of like trying to push a beach ball underwater when it comes to suppression. You keep trying to push it down. Eventually it pops up, and it pops up with even greater force. So that's usually the way I kind of try to explain it to clients, that it feels like it temporarily might be a solution because you don't want to feel this emotion. But in the long term, it tends to amplify emotional distress.
So in the short term, what will happen is there's that link between, physical and mental health, right? So if somebody is really trying hard to suppress, as you said, they're going to notice some exacerbated physiological symptoms. But even if they can kind of work their way through that or discount it, ultimately the suppression is not going to be something that they can manage long term. And as you're saying, when it comes up, eventually it will come up bigger and greater and probably more problematic than it would have if they had tried an alternative strategy when they first experienced it.
Exactly. And I think what's important with just to recognize with, suppression is that it can sort of, it reinforces this narrative that and this perception that these emotions are intolerable, that these emotions are unmanageable, that they're dangerous, right? Because as soon as they show up for you, you say, I don't want to feel this, I shouldn't be feeling this. And to some degree, it ends up kind of reinforcing the cycle of wanting to not feel it even more. And because of that, we add almost a second layer of suffering to the existing difficult emotion that you're going through. So it's like if you get anxious, for example, and you're anxious about the anxiety, or you're angry about the anxiety, or you're sort of frustrated about the anxiety. These are all these secondary emotions that as a response to the initial emotion that make it harder for you to process the initial emotion to begin with.
Okay, so this is really helpful, and I was just about to ask you, how does this present? So you mentioned anxiety and then some of the secondary things that might come up as a response to suppressing or trying to manage/suppress the anxiety. Anxiety is a common mental health challenge. It makes up a lot of the caseload that we see at Thrive, and I don't think that we're unique in that way. So can you walk me through what it might look like for a client that comes to see you, having that anxiety, feeling like I really shouldn't be experiencing this. I need to feel and seem like I'm more in control. Talk me through the secondary emotions and then the implications for them.
Yeah, so a lot of times, a client comes in for anxiety, and the way that they're framing their problem is that, something's wrong with me. I'm feeling anxiety. I shouldn't be feeling anxiety, and I need this to go away, right? And a lot of times what happens is that I think what happens with clients is that they have an expectation, which is understandable, that when they come to therapy, the end goal is symptom reduction, that they don't feel the anxiety. So I might see them the next week and they say, I didn't have as much anxiety this week. They come back, they say, well, actually, I feel like I'm regressing. Anxiety came up for me in the past week. And I always try to tell clients it's not ultimately about symptom reduction, although of course I understand that could be a goal, but it's about how we learn to respond to these emotions differently and how we learn to relate to them differently, right? So I always say it's not about the emotion being problematic per se, but our reaction to the emotion. So the relationship that we have to the emotion is more important than the emotion itself, right? And so we sort of go through a process where we get a sense of what have you been trying to do to get rid of this anxiety, right? To try to change it. And oftentimes clients come with a lot of what we call these control strategies. There are ways that we try to get rid of, eliminate, control these unwanted internal experiences, whether that's, emotions, physical sensations, thoughts, or even memories. And they've tried all these different things. Like I've tried to, change scenery. I've tried to do this. I've tried to take herbal supplements, all these kind of things that they've tried. And they end up still feeling the anxiety. And so I often tell clients, think about it from this perspective, just a thought. Perhaps the problem is the control strategies that we've been trying to do to eliminate the anxiety, and not so much the anxiety itself, because although it's an uncomfortable emotion, and although it's completely understandable that, you're coming to therapy to try to work through it and understand it, the thing that gets problematic and the cycle that we tend to get stuck in is when we start having these reactions to it in a way that ends up increasing our suffering and getting us stuck in this kind of avoidance reactivity cycle. We try to avoid it as much as possible. We try to resist it as much as possible, and then we end up getting stuck in a cycle when it comes to that.
I think one of the things that might be helpful for us to discuss in line with what you just shared is the function of emotions. So I think if we surveyed random people and said, would you categorize anxiety as something positive or negative? Almost everyone, if not everyone, would put it in the negative, the bad camp, right? But is it really bad? I know that it might reach levels that could interfere with functioning and we might want to try to address it. But what is the function of these so-called negative emotions? Why do we have them? How does it fit into the bigger picture of our emotional experience as human beings?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think, when it comes to emotions, I always say this to clients, like emotions are neither good nor bad, but they're just part of the human experience. They're part of the human condition. And we're here to experience the whole spectrum of emotions, and although they might not be pleasant, all emotions are messengers. They're signals. They carry really important information about our needs, about our values, about things that are really important to us in life. And so, emotions, whether they're challenging or whether they're uplifting, they all have a functional purpose. So let's focus on the challenging ones for the sake of the conversation. For example, disgust, moving, it signals moving away from something that could actually be harmful to you. So it is protective in that way. Even anxiety, since we're on the topic of that, think about, for example, if you hear about a family member getting diagnosed with a health condition, you get a surge of anxiety. And then it motivates you to look online, what doctor can I get? And so they all have this functional purpose, even guilt. So guilt is something that can signal to us what our values are, ways that we can sort of recorrect, reflect on what we've done. And so in a way, these emotions are all designed to help us survive and adapt as human beings.
I think this is a really, really important point that sometimes we forget, especially if we're swept or caught up in this wave of these so-called negative emotions. All of the emotions are there to teach us something. Some of them do have that functional, adaptive survival element to them, as you were just sharing. And then I think the other piece is that how can we really experience or understand one emotion without having been through the other? So if we really just want to simplify the point that I'm trying to make, how would you even know what happiness or joy is if you've never experienced something like sadness or disappointment? There needs to be that level of contrast and comparison in order for us to understand and really feel. So this idea that emotions should be divided into these categories of good and bad, that we should only seek to experience the positive and good ones and that we should avoid the negative ones, takes away our ability to survive, adapt, function, and it takes away some of our humanity as well.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's a really important point that you're making. And it sort of, what comes to mind for me as you were talking is this sort of cultural trend, this cultural mindset that we see in this modern self-help culture, which is, related to toxic positivity. And how oftentimes there's this overemphasis on a positive mindset to the point where we sort of invalidate, we dismiss, we minimize our authentic emotional experience. And because of that, I think what can happen, when we think of this, toxic positivity, it's things like, just get over it, don't dwell on it, just stay positive. At least other people have it better, other people have it worse than you. These kind of messages. And I think what tends to happen is that we implicitly kind of internalize it in a way where we say, actually, these challenging emotions are not acceptable. And this can prevent authentic emotional processing, whereby we're able to sort of sit with a challenging emotion and we don't feel the pressure to replace it and fix it quickly with positivity. So I think in many ways that, like you said, we have to have the contrast, that there's a lot of value in experiencing that contrast when it comes to our well-being.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think what happens sometimes is things get taken a little bit too far. So as you were sharing about positive emotions, what came to mind for me was Martin Seligman's PERMA model for happiness and well-being. And one of them, one of the pillars of well-being, according to this evidence-based model, is positive emotions. And positive emotions, according to this model, include optimism, gratitude, and mindfulness. Those are all good things. Those are things that have positive benefits on our mental health and well-being. At the same time, they can coexist with other things. You can be optimistic sometimes, you can be pessimistic other times, and it's very, very much needed. It's not about only exclusively experiencing those positive emotions, even if we know that they're good for us. There still is a place for the others, and sometimes in this toxic positivity culture, it leaves people in their interpersonal lives feeling really invalidated or excluded. At least that's what I see in my life as well as in my practice. When someone says, some of the phrases that you shared a little while ago, like, just get over it. It's not that simple. And like, I can be grateful that, I'm healthy and that I have a roof over my head, and okay, I'm not going through some of the atrocities that we're seeing in the world right now. I can be grateful about that. I can still be upset about something else. It's not one or the other, right?
Definitely. I think that's a good point. And I think it's, I think it also brings a lot of self-judgment when it comes to our own emotional experiences. I shouldn't be feeling this way. Why can't I just be happy? Why can't I get over it? Why can't I look at things on the bright side? You know what I mean? As if something's wrong with the way we're processing things, when in reality, we're just trying to process things in a genuine manner in terms of how we really are feeling about a certain situation that could be really difficult. So I do think it amplifies a lot of shame, a lot of self-judgment, even if it's well-intentioned, know. So people might say, well, what's wrong with saying, look at things on positively or look at things on the bright side? oftentimes it tends to reinforce this notion of, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this way, right? And I think we come back to this kind of perception of resistance when I feel a certain emotion, although the emotion itself could actually have a lot of valuable information that we need to kind of explore and look deeper into.
Okay, so I definitely hear the point that you're making about the resistance and how people are kind of presenting and they're going through this. And you said that there's the self-judgment piece. There was one phrase that you used a few moments ago, which is, why can't I just be happy? Walk me through what that looks like when someone has this thought about themselves. There is a judgment there, as you were mentioning. How does that usually end up playing out in terms of additional thoughts, emotions, behaviors? How might it impair their ability to kind of function and experience different areas of their life?
Yeah, I think what can happen is, and what I've seen often in my practice, is that people start pathologizing their experience. And in a way, they start saying, well, something's wrong with me, right? I'm not happy. I shouldn't be feeling this way. And again, a lot of times people signal happiness with a success of some sort, like they're doing well, you know what I mean? And in a way, what I think can happen is that this kind of, notion of, why can't I just be happy? In essence, you're trying to attain a state that isn't sustainable to always seek to attain, right? So yes, we would all like to be happy, right? And we would like to be happy as much as we can. But again, I think it's this kind of narrative that's devaluing these challenging emotions in a way that, again, amplifies the resistance, amplifies the suppression, amplifies avoidance tendencies, right? So sometimes people feel like if something triggers this challenging emotion, I'm going to avoid it. I'm just not going to, people, places, situations. If it's going to trigger this discomfort, I'm going to get into self-judgment. I'm going to just avoid it altogether. And that can actually have an effect on where people lose connection to things that are meaningful, things that are valuable, things that provide their life with a sense of meaning and purpose, because they start narrowing their life down to resisting or trying to avoid discomfort. For whatever reason, people also want to avoid the self-criticism that comes with discomfort. And they do that at the expense of actually connecting with things that are meaningful. So as an example, say, someone experiences social anxiety, and so they end up feeling the surge of social anxiety come up, and so they say, you know what, I'm going to cancel plans. And they do that quite often because they don't want to experience the discomfort that comes with that feeling. And in that way, you're feeling a relief because you're saying, I don't feel this anymore. I don't feel this feeling in my body. So there's some sort of relief that you don't feel it. But at the same time, you're disconnecting with a value that could be very meaningful, which is social connection.
Yeah, and we know social connection is like the number one predictor when it comes to well-being. And then I would imagine that for a lot of people that have that social anxiety, even if they're getting that temporary relief by backing out of those plans, eventually they're going to look at themselves in the mirror and say, why can't you just get over it, right? Why can't you just do it? So even if they're avoiding that emotion, there's still that self-criticism and judgment that's coming up for how they're managing it. And that can also be problematic, I would imagine.
Definitely. I think the self-criticism comes either way, right? When the emotion comes and you don't want to feel it, and then when the emotion, you get relief, but you still judge yourself for actually not doing the things you feel would actually connect you with meaning and purpose or values that are important to you.
Yeah.
So in that way, I feel like you can get stuck again in the loop that we talked about, avoidance and reactivity to the emotion that you're feeling because it's challenging and there's a lot of discomfort that comes with it.
There was something that you said a few moments ago when we were talking about this idea of like, why can't you just be happy, and having these markers and indicators of success that people are striving or yearning for, and thinking that, just when I get there, I'll be happy. I think it's safe to say that a lot of us here in the UAE are pretty privileged and pretty blessed, and we've got a lot of good things going for us. At the same time, I see a lot of people, again, in my personal and in my professional life, who, if you look at them objectively, they tick all the boxes. They're successful professionally. They have social connections to varying degrees. They are attractive, which, you know, some people don't really like to say is a marker of success, but research shows us that it is definitely something that people strive for and is associated with the way that we're being perceived. And yet they still feel like there's something missing. And then I often find that there's a guilt that comes with that, you know, I keep hearing these messages and I keep seeing all of these other people that maybe don't have what I have. And now I feel bad about feeling bad about having all of these things. How do you work through something like that with someone?
I think it's so feeling bad that you, if I'm getting it right, feeling bad that you have all these things in your life, but you're still not happy. Is that
Exactly.
what you're saying?
Exactly. So I tick all the boxes. If someone looks at me or looks at that person objectively, they'd be like, wow, their life must be perfect. I don't feel like my life is perfect. I feel like actually all of these things are missing. And maybe I think if I just got this, I would be able to achieve that success and happiness. But I always seem to fall short. So
yeah, I mean, what comes to mind is the difference between goals and values. I think oftentimes if we focus a lot on goals, we're always looking for the next thing, right? So we're saying, okay, once I achieve this, I'll feel better. Once I achieve that, I'll, you know, tick some sort of box in terms of my career. And I think what's hard with that is that we miss out on the means to get to the goal because we're so focused on the goal. So perhaps we look at that person and it's like goal, tick, 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 all these things that they wanted to achieve. But when it comes to values is more about, it's kind of the glue between goals. It infuses any goal-directed behavior with purpose, right? So oftentimes if we focus too much on goals, we miss out on actually important values that we have that are just not being attended to, right? They're not, and I see a lot of clients that actually they're not really clear on their values. So they say, I don't really know what my values are. And so sometimes we do, you know, some sort of process where we kind of get values clarification. But I think oftentimes we miss out on the, you know, the significance of when our behavior is driven by values. You know, so things like having an impact, contribution, you know, mastery is a value. Values are a process, right? So you don't have an end goal to them, but they tend to infuse your life with a sense of meaning and purpose. And so oftentimes, if there's too much of a goal-directed focus, I think it kind of leaves people not necessarily feeling as content.
Yeah, and I think what I'm taking away in part from what you just said is that sometimes we need to focus a little bit less on what is the outcome and focus a little bit more on the process. So achieving a goal might be more outcome oriented, whereas values are things that are infused in the way that we get there, and they're really by definition are guiding principles that motivate our behavior. So if we hold a particular value and we're acting in such a way that espouses that value, it is going to be more beneficial for us irrespective of whether or not we achieve that goal in the timely manner.
Exactly. So there is this interesting video by a doctor called Dr. Russ Harris, and he's an acceptance and commitment therapist. And he does this kind of a cartoon video, and he says, okay, so the goal is that the parents are taking these kids to Disneyland, and then all these things start happening on the way, like their car gets, you know, broken and they get delayed, and all these things are happening that are kind of creating obstacles to the goal. But one of the kids is so focused on the goal of getting to Disneyland, and so he gets really upset and frustrated, and he just wants to get there. Whereas the other kid is focused on the values of what he's experiencing. So adventure, because, you know, certain things are happening that aren't necessarily, you know, what they thought of. And so that's like an interesting way to assess like how we can actually relate to our values, even in the process of trying to get to a goal.
So you mentioned values a few times and also reference that it's something that can come up in therapy. How does values kind of fit into the therapeutic process when it comes to changing our relationship with challenging emotions, as is our topic today?
Yeah, so values can be really important because they often provide us with a motivation to sit with and move through discomfort, so change our relationship to these challenging emotions, because they end up shifting our focus to behavior that's directed by our values. So if we go back to the example about, social anxiety, so if that person was focused on values, which is social connection, as one of the values, let's say, then they would actually say, well, you know what, I'm actually going to find a way to sit through this discomfort that I'm feeling so that I don't avoid this because it's in line with my values. So they facilitate that meaningful connection with values and allowing us to kind of have a purpose of why am I going to sit through this discomfort because it aligns with my values. So that's where it can be really helpful when it comes to this, perspective of how we change our relationship to these challenging emotions.
No, that's very helpful, and I can see the practical value of that for clients as well as just for people that are experiencing some of these challenges and the suppression and things like that. But actually going back to this video, I haven't seen it, but it sounds interesting. We were talking earlier about this idea of toxic positivity and just sort of get over it, keep calm and carry on and all of that kind of stuff. Could we argue that the kid that's like, no, this is just an adventure as part of the Disneyland process, it's not really that big of a deal, it's fine, we're going to get there in the end, is exhibiting a little bit of toxic positivity there?
I think that's an interesting point. And in some ways I guess it's the thing that's values can help with is that we don't want to use values as a way to suppress uncomfortable emotions, right? So if the kid's frustrated, it's not like, oh, just suppress that, just focus on, what's good and what's happening and the adventure and that sort of thing. But so that's not not meant to be the intention with it. It's more meant to be that when you experience the discomfort, so even if the kid did get, frustrated, that it's okay to sit through that frustration, because sometimes they sort of get reminded of actually, well, yeah, it's, it is an adventure, right? And to some degree, if we take it to in an extreme way, it can be, some sort of toxic positivity. But the intention is not to focus on ways to feel good or to be positive. It's more that, is this behavior that I'm gonna, this behavior that I'm moving towards in line with a value? And if that's the case, then it helps you sit through the discomfort because you say, well, there's a bigger purpose for this, there's more meaning if I focus on something that's actually of value to me. Does that make sense?
It does. And what I'm taking away from what you're sharing is that the intentionality is really important and the way that you approach it makes a big difference. So if the person that we're talking about, this child, says, well, I shouldn't be feeling this way and this is not the right way and I should be grateful and all of that, and then just suppresses and flips a switch and makes it all about this really exciting adventure, then that could be kind of in the camp of toxic positivity. But what I'm hearing from you is that in this case, it was more of a reframe almost. Like, okay, I'm frustrated, I'm annoyed, maybe I'm a little bit angry, maybe I'm disappointed. So many different things can be coming up for me, and that's all valid. At the same time, if I sort of zoom out a little bit, I can make space for the fact that, this is going to make a really good story one day. I'm here on this journey with my family, and even if this part of it kind of sucks, it still is an adventure, and we're going there. So it's just a bit of a reframe, looking at it kind of more holistically rather than intentionally trying to suppress.
Exactly. And I think the point is not to suppress, right? The whole point is that we want to normalize the fact that you're experiencing discomfort when it shows up for you, in the sense that it's okay to feel these uncomfortable feelings. And if the person says, well, I guess it's an adventure, then that's, an interesting way to reframe it. But the point is that, I think the essential point is that we don't want to suppress the feelings for the sake of, I need to force myself to see it in a different manner. Right?
And I need to not look negative as well in front of other people and show that I'm grateful for this. So the key is, are they doing it to suppress, or is it part of a greater kind of picture? And is there an alignment with values that differentiates this situation from being toxic positive to being not?
Yeah, and I think the distinction is how focused are you on the outcome, right? So if you're very focused on the outcome, then yes, you may feel much more frustration, anger, and these kind of reactive emotions. Whereas if you're focused on the process, then perhaps there's more of an accessibility to values that make the whole experience more interesting for you. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, definitely. So we talked about a lot of different layers when it comes to these challenging emotions, what they are, how they're labeled, how people can have a tendency to suppress or avoid them. And you were sharing how it's really important to try to accept and make space for them, because they are part of the human condition and experience, and they do hold their own value. So how does that work? What would that look like for someone out there watching us thinking that, I'd like to give this a bit of a go?
Yeah, so I think the important thing I want to normalize is that these are, they are difficult emotions to experience. They feel really uncomfortable. So I want to sort of emphasize that I understand why people have this reaction to not want to experience them, right? They're not comfortable, right? Some of them feel really, really difficult to lean into. And also, if we think about, even biologically, like our brain's own survival mechanism, the way our brain's wired, we are wired to avoid pain and discomfort because from an evolutionary perspective, that signaled danger. So if you apply the same mechanism to emotional discomfort, we almost instinctively feel like these emotions are dangerous, these emotions are threatening, when they're actually not harmful, right? So that can even create more resistance when they show up for us. Things like panic, anxiety, fear, these kind of reactive emotions that trigger the fight or flight response in our body, they trigger the same system that signals danger, right? When there's an actual danger that you're facing. So again, really, really hard to face and really, really hard to sit through these emotions. And so I think when we bring in the topic of acceptance, it's quite a bit of a daunting word, a bit of a big word to some degree in terms of how do I even do this, right? And acceptance is not about wanting the emotion to be there. It's not about liking the emotion. It's about making space for it, right? So you move from being someone who's resisting it to someone who's making space for it, right? So we usually say observing that emotional experience because it helps you create a bit more space for it. And acceptance means that there's a willingness to make space for it in the moment that it shows up for you. So a lot of times clients tell me, well, I don't want to accept the depression and I just stay in the depression. And I always say it's not about resignation, right? It's definitely not some sort of resignation to the life circumstance you're in. If you're in a abusive relationship, it's not about resigning to that. It's not about resignation of this kind of emotional challenge that you're experiencing, like depression. Acceptance is a very active process, right? It's not a passive endurance of pain or suffering. It's an active process where there's a willingness to make space for this emotion in the moment it shows up. And that's a key point, because some clients say, well, I don't want to always make space for it. And I say, well, it's only in those moments that it shows up, because the alternative is to resist. And with resistance, there's a lot more suffering.
It doesn't work.
Yeah. So I think that's an important thing to zoom in on. You just have to be making that space when it shows up for you, because emotions always have this peak, right? It's like a wave. They go up, they have a peak in intensity, and then they go down. And I think it's always helpful to remind clients that you just need to do this when it shows up for you. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And before when you were talking, I think a couple of things really jumped out at me. Number one, absolutely, these emotions can be extremely uncomfortable and painful. And I think it's important for us to normalize that. But then I started thinking about our physical health. You were saying that we will go out of our way sometimes to avoid the experience of pain. Again, understandable. But if we flip that from mental health and emotional experience to physical health, imagine, and some people do suffer from this condition, that their pain receptors aren't working. That actually puts us in greater danger than if like the pain serves a purpose, right? Pain tells our body that there's something that needs to be attended to. And I can see a little bit of a parallel, even if it's moving from the physical, signal and implications to the mental and emotional ones. So just because it's painful doesn't mean that we should avoid it, because it's not necessarily bad. There is a space for it, and we need to try as best as we can to allow it to occupy some of that space. And by allowing it to occupy some of that space, it doesn't mean that we take that on as our default. And I think that's probably where some of that resistance is. When you tell someone, make space for the sadness, for example, they think in a very black and white way that if I make space for the sadness, I'm going to become this overwhelmingly sad person, and that's going to be who I am. It's not who you are. It's just a snippet or a sliver of your emotional experience in that moment. And it's very normal, even if it feels kind of bad.
Exactly. I think that's a really good point, because a lot of times I do see clients come in and they have a very strong identification with the emotion that they're experiencing. So I'm an anxious person, I'm a depressed person. The strong identification with it makes it harder to work through that emotion as it shows up for you, because emotions are always these temporary waves that come up, right? They never stick around persistently. There's always this up and down movement that happens. And oftentimes the resistance is actually what keeps them around for longer. You know what I mean? And so the identification part, I think, is really important, because when you start identifying your sense of self with this emotion, it becomes so much more overwhelming. You know what I mean? And we always say there's this almost like a healthy emotional observation that you want to engage in, where you're observing the emotion as though, and there's metaphors for this. So for example, let's say there's like a garden hose, right? The emotion is like the water passing through, and you're the exterior of the garden hose, right? So you're not fused with that emotion as though it's part of your sense of self. And that's where I think it can be really challenging for people.
It's something that passes through you.
Exactly. Because they feel they're going to get stuck in this. And this, I've always had, depression, and how am I going to get out of it? And we always want to kind of bring it back to this narrative of it's an emotion passing through. So this non-identification process can play a really important role.
Yeah, I really like that metaphor. And as you were expressing and talking about the over-identification, what came up for me is the fact that we have biases in the way that we see things. And when someone labels another person or even themselves, they're more likely to look for evidence that supports that perception. So if I see myself as I'm an anxious person and I over-identify with that emotion and I label myself as such, sometimes I will definitely be exhibiting anxious tendencies, but in other times where things are a little bit more ambiguous, I'm probably still going to see myself in that light and through that frame, because that's how we are, right? So it ends up being a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy at times as well.
I think so. I think it does. I also think that, when you have that focus that that's how I am, so I'm an anxious person, then you're also likely to start narrowing your life down, right? So this is going to bring my anxiety. This is going to bring my anxiety. And it's harder to see it in a way where it's an emotion passing through. And it's harder to work with it when it comes up for you, when you're identified with it, right? So I think, again, that can also perpetuate the self-judgment, and that this is how I am, and, all these different things, because you start isolating yourself almost from other people, because you might say, well, I'm an anxious person. This person can handle this, but I'm an anxious person, so I can't really do this. You know what I mean? So it can create a bit of that narrative that I don't think is helpful for people.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing from you now is that there's just this sense of stuckness, right? That this is who I am. There's nothing that I can really do about it. And this also differentiates me from other people. And so the best way for me to try to manage that is to further narrow my experiences, which then can just add fuel to that over-identification. And then you kind of get stuck in this cycle. So again, as you were saying before, a big strategy is kind of noticing, observing, and accepting in the sense of making space for it and knowing that it's going to be something that is a small slice of who you are and something that's passing through for you in that moment, as it has probably many times before.
Exactly. And if you think about it from the perspective of, that we want to find a way to process and move through the emotion, because that's the only way that we can do it, right? Moving through something, as opposed to we're suppressing it, numbing it, denying it, avoiding it, all these control strategies that we use just not to feel the discomfort. And so a lot of times I tell my clients, we are finding ways to be comfortable with the discomfort, with the uncomfortable feelings, because it's not about, again, it's not about wanting them to be there, but it's about the fact that as human beings, they do show up for us for whatever reason they show up for us. And when they show up for us, what can we do in those moments to help ourselves through that process? And that's where I think, even self-compassion is important, because people quickly go into that judgment. It's still here. It's not going away. What's
I'm never
wrong
going to
with me?
change. Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so we also want to bring in that lens of self-compassion, which some people really struggle with, to say, it's okay that I feel this emotion right now. And we're not talking about the thoughts, right? If the thought's telling me, oh, something really bad's going to happen, triggers the anxiety, we're not focusing on what brought the anxiety per se in these moments. We're just saying, well, if the anxiety showed up for me, well, it's fine. It's in my body right now. Like, I have to just kind of create space to work through it, as opposed to be caught up in it and then have that reactivity to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm imagining that some of the people tuning in right now are wondering, okay, well, I need to move through it. I need to make space for it. We talked quite a bit about anxiety for a number of reasons. What does it actually look like? Like, if I am someone who is quite anxious and I'm engaging in a lot of these things that we talked about, and I'm sitting with you in a therapy room, how will you help me learn how to move through these emotions and make space from them when I've been very conditioned and I'm very comfortable, at least on the surface level of trying to avoid, suppress, etc.
Yeah, so I think when we start talking about the topic, changing our relationship to challenging emotions, it's trying to help the client reframe this notion that the emotion is the problem to my reaction to the emotion is actually problematic here. And again, the emotion itself can be really uncomfortable. There's a lot of reasons why you're getting the anxiety that we want to explore. It's valid that you're coming to say, well, I don't want to keep feeling this anxiety, right? So when I say the emotion is not the problem, I don't mean that you're just like I said, we'll just forget about the anxiety. Who cares? Like, it's normalize it to that degree. I mean that we can get stuck in the cycle where the reaction makes it so much more problematic to actually process and move through the emotion. And that's what we want to do, right? We want to find ways to process it and move through it, as opposed to resist it and avoid it. And so sometimes when we kind of think of the bigger picture perspective, and I sometimes like to give that to clients when they're really focused on symptom reduction, is that it's like when you stop fighting the waves, you learn how to surf, right? So the real, when we zoom out, the real thing that we want to achieve is the way to stop struggling with it, almost like a tug of war. We use this metaphor with acceptance and commitment therapy a lot, like we're struggling with the emotion as if it's a tug of war. It's just like, how do you learn to drop the rope? And that can really free up a lot of space for people energetically, even just mentally, to be like, I don't have to struggle with this emotion in the way that I have been. And so we create space for changing and shifting the way we relate to these emotions, the way we perceive them, and the way we judge ourselves for having them.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I picked up on, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there is an element of helping clients see where they have a sense of power and autonomy. Because when you're saying it's this tug of war, I'm imagining it as this impossible tug of war that you're never going to win. It's a game that's rigged against you, but you continuously play it. but you might not be able to change or take away or even reduce your experience of these emotions. And we talked about why we don't even want that. But let's say that you're kind of in that zone of this is my goal. But if we shift the focus to, okay, well, it is going to come up. How are you going to actively and proactively deal with it when it comes up? It puts a little bit of the control back in the hands of the person that is suffering or struggling. And we were talking about anxiety as being one of the main things that people sort of present with, and having a sense of control when you're anxious can be really helpful, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think it's, so I think, I often say that we can't control the thoughts and emotions that show up for us, in the sense that when they show up, right? If you try to push them away, then there's this rebound effect that we talked about. They tend to show up with even more intensity. So when it comes to control, it's like the tug of war is like, we don't want to keep trying to control it in a way where we're trying to, manage it, where we're suppressing, where we're,
it's
all these
coming. You're going to
things.
experience it no matter what you do.
Exactly, right? So I think what you said is really important, because we want to empower the client to say, you know what, I have ways to work through an emotion that's challenging, and it can feel so much more empowering than just, well, I found a way to reduce the intensity of it in this moment because I was given a breathing technique. But I think breathing techniques are really helpful, they're really important, but they're, because they allow us to move from the fight or flight, sympathetic nervous system into that parasympathetic rest and digest, meaning that we're feeling that we're not in immediate threat right now, because this breathing allowed my body to signal to my, to get the signal that I'm safe. So they're useful. But when we think about the bigger picture perspective of how we want to empower clients when they leave therapy, is that, you have a way to work through these challenging emotions that come up for you, and to make space for them. And that's really, I think, an important and powerful thing that they can leave with, is that they're going to show up because that's what life's about, right? We're going to have all these, experiences, and some are going to trigger these really challenging emotions, but I actually have a way to work through them and process them that's beyond these control strategies.
So the goal really shifts from, I don't want to experience something that is impossible to avoid forever. And when I start to face these things that I've been conditioned to believe are negative and also can feel quite uncomfortable, I will find ways to make space for them and work my way through. And I will try to find ways as well to disentangle myself from them and see that there is a little bit of a separation between me as a person, a whole person, a human, and these emotions. And so these are some of the things, the techniques and the processes that you use with your clients in ACT and with some of the other modalities that you practice.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Thank you for your time today. It was a really enlightening conversation about different types of emotions, the way that we respond to them, and how we have some power and control to make space and accept and lean into them. I really appreciate your time and your insights. And if anyone wants to find you, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, you're with us at Thrive since November 2023, supporting individuals 16 and above, as well as couples in English as well as Arabic. Thank you, Dr. Dana, for your time. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.